Hello and welcome to Popular Antiquarian, the podcast about a middle-aged man trawling through the weird and forgotten corners of pop culture. That middle-aged man is me, HJDoom, and this is another episode where I'm delving into the back catalogue of the Asylum, the mockbuster-focused low-budget studio that simply refuses to die. This time we are looking long and hard at a curious proposition, a mockbuster based on a film that was arguably a better meme than it was a movie, Snakes on a Plane. They don't have $30 million to spend, and they certainly don't have Samuel L. Jackson delivering catchy lines in his signature style, but what they also don't have is any shame whatsoever. This is Snakes on a Train, which gets bonus points for sounding incredibly similar to the movie they are aping. They were always going to be confusing some nans with this one. Now, I saw Snakes on a Plane in the cinema, where my overall feeling was a hearty and enthusiastic shrug. It's a broadly serviceable bit of schlock, but the trailer was better than the film, and the movie poster was better than the trailer. Jackson's effortless charisma and impeccable credentials lifted what was otherwise a film that plays out more or less exactly how you would imagine a film about snakes getting loose on a plane would play out. The big issue with that movie is that without something else in the mix, there's simply not 90 minutes of material in the premise. It is a short film stretched out to be a blockbuster, and the fact that it generated so much hype and internet interest wound up being an albatross around the film's neck. Going back and doing reshoots based on internet nerds' ideas about what ought to be in the movie was also a bad plan. Turns out crowdsourcing your writing is almost as bad an idea as allowing Zack Snyder to write your movie. It had been built up into this thing that would be the funniest, most outrageous B-movie ever, and when the result was an adequate but unremarkable critter movie, the film wound up being less of an event and more just another film that was released. I haven't seen it since, and other than being a cautionary tale about the perils of too much hype and embracing armchair quarterbacks, the world has more or less forgotten it. None of this filled me with enthusiasm for the idea of watching a broadly similar film set on a different form of transport. Critter films are fairly hard to land at the best of times. Arachnophobia is great, but it's something of an outlier in critter movies. From self-important disaster movies like The Swarm to B-movie nonsense like 1988's The Slugs, adapted from a pretty bad Sean Hudson novel, they've all tended to struggle because ultimately there's not a lot you can actually do cinematically with some animals. A slug slithers and it eats things. A bee flies and stings things. That's what you've got to work with. Snakes do have an advantage in that they come in various sizes and they both bite and squeeze. And if they're big enough, they can swallow people whole, which is always a cool image. But they're still kind of limited as antagonists unless you want to go down that route of making them weirdly intelligent, and then you aren't really making a critter movie anymore. Faced with this dilemma, the Asylum chose, appropriately enough, to embrace absolute insanity. Snakes on a Plane is very much the film you expect when some snakes get loose on a plane. Snakes on a Train is very much not that. I need to stress that there's a chance you'll come out of the plot summary with the idea that this film is awesome, and it's very much not awesome. I think it's interesting, a much more interesting film than the source material's lowest common denominator pandering, but awesome it is not. We open in the deserts, close to the Mexican border, where two undocumented migrants are having a rough time. A husband needs to get his wife to Los Angeles because she's not well. Not well in the way that makes you throw up green jelly, and also the occasional snake which the husband is catching in jars and storing. With limited transport options, they stow on board a train heading across the country to LA with a small group of other undocumented immigrants who have bribed their way into the baggage car. Meanwhile, a classic list of B-movie bit parts are boarding the fractionally nicer end of the train where there's seats and that. You've got some surfer dudes, a pair of young women hoping to make a new start in LA, one of whom is smuggling drugs, a couple of divorcees, that sort of thing. As they travel through the night, the sick woman keeps throwing up more and more snakes, and her husband gets into a massive fight with some of the other stowaways. He can do magic as well. Did I mention that? He can do magic. He fills a bad man with snakes to teach him a lesson about snakes and harassing people who are full of snakes. It transpires the woman has been cursed for running away and not marrying the man her family preferred. Curses in this film involve either filling someone with snakes or removing snakes from them. There is a tiresome subplot involving a horny narcotics agent and the pulchritudinous drug smuggler, and then we're into the final act and there's snakes everywhere. The magic husband kills the driver and smashes the controls to prevent them from stopping before they hit LA, and then just as you're settling in for a fairly standard finale, the cursed woman eats a bunch of snakes and then turns into a massive snake which eats the entire train. The entire train. That gigantic snake is dealt with some more magic, and then we roll credits, all done and dusted in a tight 90 minutes. The best thing about this film is how outrageously gonzo the story actually is. It's arguably more entertaining in outline than it is in the details, but I'm going to claim that it's still somewhat entertaining in the details. The climax is a masterpiece of left-field writing that deserves to be studied in creative writing classes. It's a genius idea because it subverts the very thing that's wrong with Snakes on a Plane, the fact that the action pans out broadly in the manner you would expect. That is a weakness of making the central premise the name of your film. You've limited your chances to surprise the audience. It immediately sets up expectations, and if you then just deliver on those expectations, the audience may feel oddly shortchanged by being given exactly what was advertised. Snakes on a Train does not do that. It makes a sudden handbrake turn right before the end, and honestly, it's a strong way to finish a movie. Of course, this being a film by the Asylum, the train-chomping snake looks like absolute rubbish. The disconnect between the idea being conveyed by the action and the action itself is gigantic. I think the idea is sufficiently good that I was prepared to overlook the PlayStation 2 style rendering of it, but however bad you think it's going to look, it's probably worse. Like one of those spots that feels a bit sore and tender, and then you go and check it in the mirror and somehow your entire head has gone red and swollen. Still, there is something majestic about the finish of a film entitled Snakes on a Train actually being train in a snake. There's some intrigue generated by the premise here early doors as well. You don't just have a crate of snakes that will need to be opened for the film to progress. Well, you do have a crate of snakes, but it's actually a Mexican woman. The fact that there's all this bizarre magic going on is another thing that helps make the film feel less predictable. The snakes themselves aren't really the focus until the final act, which allows them to run through a bunch of the expected snake business in pretty short order and get back to the spooky madness that's been holding the film together through the rough patches. The opening is genuinely good at subverting your expectations for what's going to happen, but also for signalling a fairly clear narrative arc. You have these people, something weird is happening to them, and it involves a woman spitting snakes into a jar. They're getting on a train. It's somehow going to become everyone else's problem. The question is, how? There's also a fairly sensible decision to dedicate a chunk of the time to the other stowaways on the train and the tensions that arise when someone is regularly spitting snakes into a jar. It gives us a deeply mediocre fight when one of the more unsympathetic travellers and his mates kick off, but also a chance for Brujo, the Snake Lady's male companion, to do some fun magic stuff and then subject some of his adversaries to a grisly and ultimately snake-based punishment for their aggression. This is all good stuff in principle, if not in execution, and helps keep up some of the excitement levels while we wait for the main event. Sadly, the same thing isn't true of the other big element designed to keep things ticking along, which is the subplot involving the two young women, the smuggled drugs and a lecherous narcotics agent who decides to use the drugs he's found as leverage for his sexual advances. Aside from being a creep, he looks distractingly like a sex pest version of Brad Pitt, which doesn't help, and there's the uncomfortable truth that all of this business only exists so he can force a woman to take her top off and get her some mandatory nudity to mention on the DVD case. This sort of thing is always tiresome for me, and I think there's many better ways to get the requisite amount of sleaze without invoking sexual threat. I just prefer my gratuitous nudity to be less coercive. I much prefer my gratuitous nudity to involve teenagers having premarital sex and then being murdered by a serial killer for daring to have premarital sex. That's the kind of hypocrisy I'm comfortable with. Sure, the narcotics agent does get punished for his transgressions, but the whole thing adds, I think, an unwelcome grindhouse vibe to what is otherwise a very silly film, and it feels out of place. I've no problem with the subplot being about a corrupt cop, but we could have had something much more focused on him stealing drugs, getting super high, and behaving like a jackass, which I think would have been more in keeping with the overall tone. I do not mind a bit of sleaze, but I prefer it to be more celebratory than threatening. As it is, there's a chunk of this movie that really feels like a chore, even compared to the rest of the movie, which also feels like a chore. When it all finally kicks off properly, though, there's something to be said for leaving all of the proper snake action to the last 20 minutes or so. We get people being bitten left, right and centre, a small child gets swallowed whole, in another sequence that sounds much better as a statement of intent than it plays out as an actual cinematic event. There's a gently baffling bit where one of the faintly grating surfer dudes seems convinced that the snake in the carriage is actually an iguana that he's going to keep as a pet. And another very odd moment where it turns out the train driver is a crack-smoking redhead for reasons that are never explained. It's all over the place at times, but it does generate at least a few additional points of interest throughout the runtime. Honestly, my favourite weird little addition is the two divorcees who are clearly extremely horny post-divorce and bond together quite sweetly in a way that adds nothing to the plot. I think I'd have been happy if the mandatory nudity had involved them just being unable to restrain themselves and hooking up in the toilet. While the CGI is trademark Asylum levels of rubbish, the practical effects are markedly better. They keep it simple and shot and edited in a way that hides the limitations, but overall, the practical stuff does a good job of conveying what is intended without shattering the always fragile suspension of disbelief. A backdrop of dimly lit railway carriages at night probably helps with that. It's a gift to low-budget productions to be able to do most of the internals under fairly easily controlled conditions. The actors generally acquit themselves quite well. Albie Castro as Brujo is fairly committed, and I definitely believe that Cameron Bass Jackson, who plays the creepy narcotics agent, was a sexual problem from the very second he came on screen. He also appeared in a film called Adventures in the Woods, a sexy musical, and I hope he was able to showcase a less sexually threatening acting style in that film. It would be very odd if he was some kind of sex pest in that as well. But it's the female lead in the shape of Julia Ruiz who should get the most plaudits, since she spends half the film coughing up jelly and plastic snakes, and towards the end has to put actual live snakes in her mouth, which doesn't sound like a great deal of fun. She is giving it her all, and I always salute that. I think it helps that we're already seeing a house style for the Asylum which demands that actors play it straight no matter how stupid the dialogue is. Honestly, I love seeing actors delivering lines like, "Too much of you is in the snakes," while doing their best sad face. Director Peter Mervis opted to do this one under a pseudonym, which suggests he thought bigger and better things were in store for him. Alas, that turned out to be untrue, and he seems to have left the film industry a few years after Snakes on a Train. He turns in perfectly adequate work here. It doesn't look great, but it does at least look like a proper film, some of the time. One of the things that particularly interests me about this movie is the underlying themes about undocumented immigrants. On one level, you could see this as a parable about America being at risk of contamination by other cultures who bring their snake-vomiting women over the border without going through proper channels, but I don't think that's the right reading. The film does not seem especially interested in portraying America as a land of innocence with its rapist cops and crack-smoking train drivers. Instead, I think this film has ended up saying something, possibly accidentally, about people who are pushed to the margins by oppressive laws and indifference. By forcing a cursed woman to hide in the baggage carriage, a society which accords her no intrinsic dignity loses the opportunity to contain her snakes, her many, many snakes. That says something to me about how structures of oppression can contain the seeds of their own destruction. There's parallels to real-world events here. People with contagious diseases who are in a country illegally are less likely to seek medical help because they don't want to be arrested and deported, and that has a knock-on effect on everyone. And we've all seen in the last few years what can happen when contagious diseases get up a good head of steam. Do I think the Asylum set out to make a film critiquing the flawed concept of the nation-state and the unexpected consequences of state repression vis-à-vis magical snake attacks? No. I think they set out to make a film about snakes on a train that would allow them to cash in on snakes on a plane's buzz. They only added the frankly demented ending because some confusion from Japanese investors who thought the poster meant that a snake would eat the train. And they heard that and said, yeah, we can do that. If it'll help. If it'll push sales in Japan, the snake can definitely eat the train. And sometimes that's how cinematic magic happens. Despite the cynicism of everyone involved, they still somehow turned out a film that, to me at least, has a message. Maybe I'm reaching, but my whole deal is looking too deeply into pop culture and treating garbage with the same seriousness as high art. If some auteur came and pitched a film that was a surreal fable about the immigrant experience which used snakes as a metaphor for disease, we would certainly accept that, I think, as a reasonable artistic proposition. Just because no one deliberately planted the message of this film doesn't mean it's not there. That's the nature of art. And ultimately, I found Snakes on a Train more memorable than its inspiration. Putting a weird spin on things just plays better with me than doing the obvious, and I'm far more forgiving of low-budget nonsense that has some silly ideas than I am of something which sold itself as a crazy movie that ultimately turned out to be fairly pedestrian. There's a perfect movie swimming around between the two, which has the production values of Snakes on a Plane and the thematic gonzo excesses of Snakes on a Train. Samuel L. Jackson is also in this hypothetical version, because we do all love Samuel L. Jackson. He's great. Well, we're 4 episodes in, and The Asylum has still failed to turn out a real absolute stinker. I've enjoyed all of them on some level. That might be about to change with the next episode, however, because we're going to look at a much more recent film that rips off one of my favourite things in the whole world, the Universal monster movies of the 30s and 40s. Can my ability to treat anything as serious art survive the desecration of actual classic movies I adore? I hope you will join me to find out. That is all for this episode. Don't forget you can support me financially and help keep this podcast ad-free in perpetuity by going to patreon.com/HJDoom and pledging as little as a single £1 to keep my quest to shine a light on the weird corners of pop culture going. Any support is deeply appreciated. If you want to get in touch with me, you can do so by emailing me at HJDoomRetroFun, all one word, @gmail.com, or by following me on Blue Sky at HJDoom. Thank you very much for listening. Take care, and I'll see you soon.